The sound of steel on whetstone echoed through the Wyoming Valley every morning at dawn. Every trapper in the region except one. While his neighbors spent the first hour of daylight sharpening their axes, preparing their blades for another day of work, Samuel Bridger walked straight from his cabin to the woodpile and started swinging. His axe bit deep into the wood with every stroke. Clean cuts, no binding, no glancing blows. He'd felled timber, split firewood, and shaped logs all day yesterday. His axe should have been dull as a butter knife. Instead, it cut like it was fresh from the blacksmith. The other trappers noticed. Of course they noticed. A man who doesn't sharpen his tools is either a fool or knows something everyone else doesn't. Samuel Bridger was no fool. He'd been in the mountains since 1828, 15 years of trapping, building, surviving, 15 years with the same axe, and that blade stayed sharp through work that would have destroyed a dozen modern axes. By 1843, when other men were wearing out their third or fourth axe head, Samuel's original blade was still cutting clean. The edge showed almost no wear. No chips, no rolls, just a razor line that seemed to maintain itself. The questions came eventually. What's your secret? How do you keep that edge? Do you sharpen at night when no one sees? Samuel would smile and say nothing much. He'd offer vague answers about good steel and proper technique, but the truth was more specific than that. Samuel Bridger knew something about axes that most modern people have completely forgotten. He understood what makes an edge hold or fail. He knew which steel to use and which to avoid. He knew how to treat the metal so it would resist wear. And most importantly, he knew techniques for cutting that preserved the edge instead of destroying it with every swing. What he knew wasn't secret. It wasn't magic. It was just knowledge that had been common among woodsmen for centuries, but was already starting to disappear by the mid-1800s. Within another 50 years, it would be almost completely lost. Today, in the 21st century, we've forgotten nearly everything Samuel Bridger knew about keeping an axe sharp. We buy axes made from the wrong steel with the wrong temper at the wrong angle. We use them incorrectly, abuse the edge, and wonder why they dull after 10 swings. Then, we blame the manufacturer or assume that's just how axes work. We never stop to think that maybe our ancestors knew something we don't. This is the story of what Samuel Bridger understood about axes that we've forgotten. It's about metallurgy and technique, about the difference between soft iron and hardened steel, about edge geometry and impact angles. It's about why a mountain man's axe from 1830 could outperform the best modern axe you can buy at a hardware store. And it's about how we lost this knowledge and what it would take to get it back. Samuel Bridger wasn't born in the mountains. He grew up in Pennsylvania, son of a blacksmith. This was crucial. He spent his childhood in the forge, watching his father work metal, learning the craft. By the time he was 12, Samuel could read steel by its color in the fire. He understood how heat changed metal's properties. He knew that the same iron could be made soft as butter or hard as glass, depending on how it was heated and cooled. This knowledge, learned young, would serve him for the rest of his life. When Samuel headed west in 1828 at age 21, he carried an axe his father had made specifically for him. This wasn't a standard trade axe. This was a tool crafted with knowledge that went back generations, incorporating techniques that blacksmiths had refined through centuries of trial and error. The axe looked ordinary enough. 3-pound head, 30-inch hickory handle, standard felling axe pattern. But the steel was different. The heat treatment was different. The edge geometry was different. Every detail had been optimized for one purpose: maintaining a sharp edge under hard use. The steel itself was the first critical difference. Samuel's axe wasn't made from modern high-carbon steel. It was made from blister steel, a specific type of steel produced through a lengthy process that created metal with unusual properties. His father had taken wrought iron bars and packed them in charcoal inside a sealed clay container. He'd heated this container in the forge for days, maintaining a careful temperature that allowed carbon from the charcoal to diffuse into the surface of the iron. The result was steel with a hard, high-carbon surface layer and a tough, low-carbon core. This combination gave the axe head both edge-holding ability and impact resistance. Modern metallurgists call this a case-hardened structure, and it's actually superior to through-hardened steel for axes. Through-hardened steel, where the entire piece is the same hardness, tends to be brittle. Hit a knot or rock, and the edge can chip or crack. Case-hardened steel has the best of both worlds, a hard cutting surface that holds an edge, backed by a tough core that absorbs shock without breaking. Samuel's father knew this intuitively from decades of making tools. Modern manufacturers often skip this step because it's time-consuming and expensive. They use through-hardened steel that's easier to produce but less durable in the field. The second critical difference was the tempering. After forging the axe head to shape, Samuel's father had heated it until it glowed cherry red, then quenched it in oil. This made the steel extremely hard but also extremely brittle. Then came the tempering process, the step that separated master blacksmiths from amateurs. He carefully reheated the axe head to a specific temperature, watching the colors that appeared on the polished steel surface. As steel heats, it oxidizes and shows different colors: pale yellow at about 380 degrees, straw yellow at 430, brown at 500, purple at 540, and blue at 570 degrees Fahrenheit. For an axe edge, Samuel's father tempered to a straw yellow about 430 degrees. This temperature relieved internal stresses in the steel without making it too soft. The result was an edge that was hard enough to resist wear, but tough enough not to chip. The back of the axe head, the pole, he tempered softer, to purple or blue, making it less likely to crack if used as a hammer. This differential tempering, hard edge and softer body, created a tool that was optimized for its actual use. Modern axes are often tempered uniformly, which is simpler but less effective. The entire head is the same hardness, which means either the edge is too soft to hold up or the body is too hard and prone to cracking. The third critical difference was edge geometry. Samuel's axe had been ground to a specific angle that balanced sharpness with durability. Too acute an angle, too sharp, and the edge would be fragile. It would cut easily, but chip or roll on impact. Too obtuse an angle, too blunt, and the edge would be durable, but wouldn't cut efficiently. It would require more force to make each cut and would bind in the wood. Samuel's father had ground the edge to approximately 25 degrees per side, creating a 50-degree included angle. This was the sweet spot for hardwood cutting. Sharp enough to bite deep, durable enough to resist damage. Modern axes often have the wrong edge angle. Cheap hardware store axes might be ground to 35 or even 40 degrees per side because it's faster to grind, and the manufacturer assumes consumers will use the axe roughly. But this makes the axe perform poorly. It requires much more force to cut, which tires the user and ironically increases edge damage because of the harder impacts. Premium modern axes might go too far in the other direction, ground to 20 degrees for a marketing claim of extreme sharpness, but this makes the edge fragile for serious work. The traditional 25-degree angle that Samuel's axe carried was the result of centuries of practical experience, but the axe itself, as well made as it was only part of the story. The bigger factor in why Samuel's axe stayed sharp was how he used it. He'd learned cutting techniques from experienced woodsmen in his first years in the mountains. These techniques were designed to preserve the edge while maximizing cutting efficiency. Modern axe users have largely forgotten these techniques, which is why even a good axe will dull quickly in modern hands. The first technique was understanding grain direction. Wood has grain, and cutting with the grain is easy, while cutting against it is hard on the edge. Samuel always examined a piece of wood before cutting it. He looked at how the grain ran. When splitting firewood, he positioned each piece so his axe would follow the natural grain lines. This meant the wood separated easily, requiring less force, creating less impact stress on the edge. When felling a tree, he made his cuts so each swing worked with the grain structure, not against it. Modern users often ignore grain entirely, just swinging away, which dramatically increases edge wear. The second technique was impact angle control. When an axe blade hits wood, it should strike at an optimal angle relative to the wood surface. Too perpendicular, and the edge tries to penetrate straight in, creating maximum resistance and stress. Too glancing, and the edge skates across the surface without cutting deep. Samuel had trained himself to hit at about a 30-degree angle off perpendicular. This allowed the edge to bite and slide simultaneously, cutting efficiently while minimizing impact stress. He controlled this angle through his stance, his grip, and his swing path. It became automatic after years of practice. Modern users often swing straight down or at random angles, creating unnecessary edge stress. The third technique was avoiding hidden hazards. Dirt, rocks, metal in the wood, all of these would damage an edge instantly. Samuel was fanatical about keeping his cutting area clean. Before felling a tree, he'd clear any debris from around the base. Before splitting wood, he'd inspect each piece for embedded stones or metal. If he saw discoloration or an odd texture that might indicate a problem, he'd reject that piece or cut around it. He knew that one hit on a rock would damage his edge more than a full day of proper cutting. Modern users often don't bother with these precautions, then wonder why their axe dulls so quickly. The fourth technique was rhythm and momentum. Samuel understood that axe work was about rhythm, not force. He'd swing in a consistent pattern, letting the weight of the axe head and the arc of the swing do the work. Each stroke looked effortless, but the axe bit deep because physics was doing the cutting, not muscle. This approach generated clean cuts with minimal edge damage. Forcing the axe, swinging too hard, trying to power through difficult cuts, all of these created edge damage. Modern users often equate axe work with brute force, swinging as hard as possible, which destroys edges rapidly through excessive impact stress. The fifth technique was knowing when to stop. Samuel never tried to cut through a difficult knot or a section where the grain was twisted and tight. He'd cut around it or abandon that piece and find an easier one. Pride wasn't worth a damaged edge. He also knew when his axe was starting to dull, which was before it became obvious. He could feel the difference in how the blade bit. He'd stop work, spend 5 minutes touching up the edge with a stone, and continue. He never let the axe get truly dull, because cutting with a dull axe damages the edge much faster than cutting with a sharp one. Modern users often keep swinging with a dull axe until it barely cuts at all, then spend an hour grinding to restore the edge. These techniques, combined with the superior axe design, meant that Samuel's axe stayed sharp through work that would quickly dull a modern axe. But there was one more factor, perhaps the most important: maintenance. Samuel maintained his axe constantly, not as a major periodic task, but as an ongoing process. Every evening he'd inspect the edge for any damage. If he found a tiny chip or roll, he'd fix it immediately with a few strokes of his whetstone. This meant the damage never accumulated. A tiny chip, fixed right away, takes 30 seconds. The same chip left to worsen through a continued use might require 30 minutes of grinding to fix. Samuel's whetstone was another piece of forgotten knowledge. It wasn't a modern, manufactured stone. It was a natural Arkansas stone, medium-fine grit, that he'd carried with him for 15 years. He knew how to use it properly. Light pressure, consistent angle, working from the heel to the toe of the edge in smooth strokes. He used water as a lubricant, never oil, because oil attracted dirt. 5 minutes of careful work each evening kept the edge in perfect condition. He almost never had to do heavy grinding because he never let the edge get damaged enough to require it. Modern users often skip daily maintenance, then do major sharpening sessions when the axe becomes unusable. This approach is backwards. It's like never changing your oil and then rebuilding your engine. Daily maintenance prevents major damage. Major damage requires major repairs that can actually weaken the edge by removing a lot of material. Samuel's axe edge had barely thinned over 15 years because he'd never had to grind away significant damage. A modern axe might lose 1/8 of an inch of material in the first year from repeated major sharpenings. The other trappers in the Wyoming Valley eventually learned Samuel's methods, or at least some of them. He wasn't secretive about it. When someone asked for advice, he'd share what he knew. But teaching someone to make a proper axe required blacksmithing skills that most trappers didn't have. And teaching the cutting techniques required supervised practice that was difficult to arrange when everyone was working independently. So the knowledge spread slowly and incompletely. Some trappers adopted a few of his practices. Others tried but lacked the skill to execute them properly. A few simply refused to believe that technique mattered that much and kept doing things their way. There was one young trapper, a man named Robert Crane, who took Samuel's teachings seriously. Robert arrived in the valley in 1840 and befriended Samuel. He'd brought a cheap trade axe that dulled almost immediately and couldn't hold an edge no matter how much he sharpened it. Samuel examined the axe and explained what was wrong. The steel was too soft, barely hardened at all. The edge angle was all wrong, ground much too blunt. The handle was too short, making efficient swings impossible. The whole tool was essentially junk, made to be sold cheaply rather than used seriously. Robert asked if Samuel's father could make him a proper axe. Samuel explained that his father had died 5 years earlier, but he'd learned enough to try forging an axe himself. He'd brought smithing tools with him to the mountains precisely because he knew tools would need repair. Over the next month, working in a makeshift forge, Samuel produced an axe head for Robert. It wasn't quite as refined as his father's work, but it embodied the same principles: case-hardened steel, differential tempering, correct edge geometry. When Robert started using the new axe, the difference was immediately obvious. It cut easier, it stayed sharp. Within weeks, Robert was telling everyone how much better a proper axe performed. But here's where the story takes a turn. In 1844, a trading post in the region started receiving axes manufactured in the East by factory methods. These axes were cheaper than anything a blacksmith could produce. They were made from better quality iron ore than was available locally. They had uniform shapes and standardized dimensions. They represented the new industrial age coming to the frontier. The trading post owner promoted them heavily. Modern manufacturing, better than handmade. And they were cheaper. A factory axe cost $3. Having a blacksmith make a custom axe cost $8 to $10 plus materials. The trappers bought the factory axes. They seemed fine at first, decent steel, clean finish. But within weeks, problems appeared. The edges dulled faster than traditional axes. The tempering was inconsistent. Some axes were too soft and wouldn't hold an edge. Others were too hard and chipped easily. The factory was producing axes for a general market, not specifically for the hardwood forests and heavy use that mountain trappers required. They were adequate for occasional home use, but not optimal for professional woodsmen. Still, they were cheap. When one wore out or broke, you bought another. The economics made sense, even if the performance was inferior. Samuel stuck with his handmade axe. Robert kept the axe Samuel had made him. But they were becoming exceptions. By the late 1840s, most trappers in the valley were using factory axes and replacing them regularly. The knowledge of what made a truly good axe was starting to fade. Young trappers who came west had never seen a master blacksmith make a tool. They had only known factory goods. They assumed that axes were meant to dull quickly and be replaced. The standard of quality was declining, and no one seemed to notice or care because the economic model had shifted. Tools were becoming disposable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten craftsmanship, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering the lost knowledge that made our ancestors' tools superior to our modern versions. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode. This pattern of decline accelerated after the Civil War. Industrial manufacturing exploded. Factories could produce thousands of axes per day. The steel was standardized. The processes were mechanized. Quality control focused on consistency rather than excellence. The axes worked more or less, but they didn't perform like the handmade axes of earlier eras. Edges dulled faster. Heads broke more easily, but they were cheap enough that performance didn't matter. Use it until it fails. Buy another one. This was the new paradigm. The knowledge held by people like Samuel Bridger and his blacksmith father became obsolete. There was no market for custom axes when factory axes cost a third as much. Blacksmiths stopped making edge tools and focused on horseshoes and repairs. Young men didn't apprentice to learn tool making because there were no jobs in it. Within one generation, the sophisticated understanding of steel, tempering, and edge geometry that had been refined over centuries was nearly extinct. By 1900, it had become rare, specialized knowledge held by only a few craftsmen. The cutting techniques suffered a similar decline. As people moved from rural to urban areas, as industrial jobs replaced outdoor work, fewer people used axes regularly. It became a specialty tool rather than an everyday implement. The casual users who occasionally needed an axe didn't have the experience to develop good technique. They just swung hard and hoped for the best. The knowledge of grain direction, impact angles, rhythm, and edge preservation disappeared from common practice. By the mid-20th century, it survived only in isolated pockets, loggers in remote areas, a few old-timers who remembered specialized craftsmen. Today, in the 21st century, we're experiencing a small revival of interest in traditional axes and proper techniques. Some craftsmen are rediscovering the old methods, making axes the way Samuel Bridger's father did. Some teachers are documenting proper cutting techniques, but this knowledge is still rare. The vast majority of people who use axes have no idea what they're missing. They buy a cheap hardware store axe, use terrible technique, and assume that's just how axes work. When someone hands them a properly made and properly used traditional axe, they're shocked by the difference. What exactly are the differences that would be obvious to anyone comparing a cheap modern axe to a traditional crafted axe like Samuel's? First, the cutting effort required. A proper axe with the right edge geometry and good steel bites, deep with moderate force. A cheap axe with a blunt edge and soft steel requires much harder swings to achieve the same cut depth. The difference in fatigue over a day of work is enormous. Second, the edge retention. A proper axe might need a light touch-up after 8 hours of work. A cheap axe might need sharpening every hour. Third, the control. A proper axe with a well-designed handle and correct weight distribution can be aimed precisely. A cheap axe with poor balance feels clumsy and unpredictable. Fourth, the sound. This is something experienced axe users notice immediately. A sharp axe cutting properly makes a clean, solid thunk sound. A dull axe makes a dull thud and often bounces back slightly. Samuel could tell how his axe was performing by sound alone. Fifth, the chips. A proper axe produces clean wood chips that fly free. A cheap axe produces crushed wood fibers that stay in the cut and bind the blade. These differences might seem subtle in description, but they're dramatic in practice. It's the difference between a tool that's a pleasure to use and one that's a frustrating struggle. The metallurgical differences are even more significant. Modern metallurgy can analyze steel composition and heat treatment with precision that Samuel's father never imagined. We can measure hardness exactly, determine carbon content to the decimal point, examine grain structure under microscopes. We know more about the science of steel than any blacksmith in history. Yet despite all this knowledge, most modern axes are made from steel that's inferior for the purpose compared to what traditional blacksmiths produced. How is this possible? The answer is economics and production methods. Traditional blacksmiths made steel that was optimized for a specific tool. They used methods that were labor-intensive but produced ideal results. Modern manufacturers make steel that's easy to produce at scale and adequate for general purposes. They can't economically justify the extra steps that would create superior performance. A factory making 10,000 axes per day can't case-harden each one individually and differentially temper each head. They use through hardening processes that can be done in bulk. The result is consistent, but not optimal. Some premium modern axe makers do use traditional methods. Companies like Gränsfors Bruk in Sweden still forge axes largely by hand, using proper steel and heat treatment. Their axes perform much better than cheap alternatives, but they also cost 5 to 10 times more. Most consumers see the price difference and assume it's just marketing or brand premium. They don't understand that there are real, substantial differences in how the tools are made. The cheap axe will work. The expensive, traditionally made axe will work much better and last much longer. But if you've never used a truly good axe, you don't know what you're missing. The technique differences are even more lost than the manufacturing knowledge. You can at least buy a good axe if you know what to look for and can afford it. But where do you learn proper cutting technique? There are a few instructional videos online, a handful of teachers at craft schools. But these are rare resources. Most people learn axe use by trial and error, developing bad habits that they never correct. They don't understand grain direction because no one taught them to look for it. They don't control impact angles because they don't know it matters. They use force instead of rhythm because that's what seems natural. Consider the specific technique of reading grain. Samuel Bridger could look at a piece of wood and instantly see how the grain ran, where it twisted, where it would split easily. This was pattern recognition developed through thousands of hours of practice. Modern users often can't see grain at all. The wood just looks like wood. Without understanding grain, they can't cut efficiently or preserve their edge. This one skill alone, if widely known, would dramatically improve how people use axes. But it's nearly extinct. You could survey 100 people who own axes, and maybe 1 or 2 would know how to read grain properly. Or consider the technique of impact angle control. Samuel Bridger had trained his body to consistently hit at the optimal angle through his stance and swing path. This was muscle memory developed through practice and feedback. Modern users swing wildly, hitting at random angles, never developing consistency. Teaching someone to control impact angle requires hands-on instruction and practice with feedback. You can't learn it from a book or video. You need someone watching you swing, correcting your stance and grip, helping you develop the feel. Without access to such instruction, most people never learn it. The maintenance knowledge is similarly lost. Samuel's practice of daily inspection and immediate repair of any edge damage is nearly unknown today. Modern users do major sharpening sessions infrequently, usually when the axe is already badly dulled. They don't understand that preventing damage is far easier than repairing it. They also often don't know how to sharpen properly. They might use power grinders that overheat the steel and ruin the temper. They might use the wrong angle or inconsistent pressure. They might remove way too much material trying to fix a small problem. All of these mistakes make the axe worse, not better. The choice of sharpening stone is another forgotten detail. Samuel used a natural Arkansas stone of medium-fine grit with water as lubricant. This combination was ideal for maintaining an already sharp edge. Modern users often use whatever stone is available, sometimes far too coarse, sometimes too fine. They might use oil-based stones that attract dirt. They might use inadequate lubricant and damage both the stone and the edge through friction. These seem like small details, but they accumulate into major performance differences over time. There's also the psychological aspect. Samuel Bridger treated his axe with respect. It was a valuable tool that he depended on for survival. He maintained it carefully because his life literally depended on its reliability. Modern users often treat axes as disposable commodities. If it breaks or dulls beyond use, they buy another one. This attitude change reflects our broader shift from a culture of maintenance and repair to a culture of disposal and replacement. But it also means we don't develop the intimate knowledge of our tools that comes from long-term use and care. Samuel used the same axe for over 30 years. By the end of that time, he knew that tool better than most people know their own hands. He could feel subtle changes in how it cut. He knew exactly how much force was needed for different types of wood. He could predict how the axe would react in unusual situations. This deep familiarity made him far more effective than someone using a new axe, even if the new axe was technically better. The relationship between craftsman and tool matters. It can't be measured in specifications, but it's real. Before we continue with how this knowledge might be recovered, I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. We're bringing back the lost skills that made old tools outperform modern ones, and your support keeps us researching these forgotten methods. Hit that subscribe button now. Can this lost knowledge be recovered? Some of it, yes. Some of it, probably not completely. The metallurgical knowledge exists in historical documents, in the work of historians of technology, in the practices of the few remaining traditional blacksmiths. Someone determined to learn could find the information and replicate Samuel Bridger's father's methods for making an axe. It would require access to a forge, significant practice to develop the skills, and patience to work through failures. But it's possible. Several modern craftsmen have done exactly this, teaching themselves traditional toolmaking from historical sources and experimentation. The technique knowledge is harder to recover. Reading grain, controlling impact angles, maintaining rhythm, these are embodied skills that must be learned through practice with feedback from someone who already knows. Books and videos can convey the concepts, but they can't create the muscle memory and perceptual skills. You need hands-on instruction. Fortunately, a few teachers do exist. Green woodworking schools teach proper axe technique. Some forestry programs cover it. Craftsmen who specialize in traditional building methods often have this knowledge. But these resources are scattered and limited. Most people don't have access to them. The maintenance knowledge is perhaps the easiest to recover. The principles are straightforward. The skills can be learned from good instruction. Several books and online resources cover proper axe sharpening and maintenance in detail. Anyone willing to invest a few hours of study and practice can learn to maintain an axe edge properly. The challenge is that most people don't realize they need to learn. They assume they already know how to sharpen an axe, even though their results are poor. Convincing people that there's a better way is harder than teaching them the better way. What would happen if this knowledge became widespread again, if people generally understood what made a good axe and how to use it properly? First, there would be market demand for better axes. Manufacturers would respond by improving quality because consumers would be willing to pay for it. Second, tool lifespan would increase dramatically. An axe that's made well and used properly might last a lifetime instead of a few years. This would reduce waste and resource consumption. Third, people doing work with axes would be more productive and less fatigued. Better tools properly used make work easier. Fourth, there would be greater appreciation for craftsmanship and traditional skills. But there are barriers to this happening. The economic structure of modern manufacturing favors cheap, replaceable goods over expensive, durable ones. Manufacturers make more money if consumers buy new tools every few years rather than once in a lifetime. There's no incentive to make tools that last forever. Retailers have limited shelf space and prefer stocking popular cheap items over niche expensive ones. The distribution system isn't set up to support traditional craftsmanship. Someone making axes the old way in small batches has trouble competing with factory production. There's also a knowledge barrier. Most consumers don't know enough to evaluate axe quality. They can't tell a good axe from a bad one by looking at it. They rely on price as a quality signal, which is often misleading. A cheap axe and an expensive axe might look similar to an untrained eye. The differences are in details, the steel composition, the heat treatment, the edge geometry. None of these are visible. You only discover them through use. By the time you realize the cheap axe is inadequate, you've already bought it. Many consumers never realize it at all because they've never used a truly good axe for comparison. The skill barrier is even higher. Even if someone buys a good axe, they need to know how to use it properly. Without training, they'll use poor technique and might conclude the expensive axe isn't any better than the cheap one. This creates a feedback loop where consumers don't see value in quality tools because they don't have the skills to use them effectively. Meanwhile, they don't develop the skills because they don't have good tools to practice with. Breaking this cycle requires simultaneous education about both tool quality and proper technique. Some modern movements are trying to address this. The bushcraft and traditional skills communities value old knowledge and try to preserve it. Green woodworking enthusiasts seek out good tools and learn proper techniques. Homesteaders and off-grid practitioners often rediscover traditional methods through necessity. These communities are small but growing. They're creating demand for quality tools and instruction. A few craftsmen are making traditional axes and finding buyers willing to pay for quality. A few schools are teaching proper axe use. The knowledge is being recovered slowly by dedicated individuals. But these are still niche communities. The vast majority of people who own or use axes have no connection to traditional knowledge. They buy whatever is available at their local hardware store, use it however seems right, and never think deeply about whether there's a better way. The knowledge remains rare and inaccessible to most people. Changing this would require systemic shifts. Education systems that valued practical skills, manufacturers that prioritized quality over volume, distribution systems that supported traditional craftsmanship, and consumer culture that valued durability over disposability. The story of Samuel Bridger's axe that never needed sharpening is ultimately about more than just axes. It's about the broader loss of practical knowledge, craftsmanship, and quality that accompanied industrialization. The factory system gave us cheaper tools and greater availability. That's valuable. But it also gave us inferior quality and loss of traditional knowledge. That's a real cost that we rarely acknowledge. We assume that modern is always better than old, that technology always represents progress, that our ancestors' methods were primitive and superseded. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's very much not true. In the case of axes, the old ways were demonstrably superior. Samuel Bridger's axe, made by an 18th century blacksmith, using methods that dated back centuries, outperformed modern factory axes. It stayed sharper longer, required less maintenance, and lasted far longer. This isn't nostalgia or romanticism. It's measurable fact. The traditional methods produced better results. We abandoned them not because we found something better, but because we found something cheaper and more scalable. We prioritized economics over performance. That was a choice, and choices have consequences. The consequences include tools that underperform, knowledge that's lost, and skills that atrophy from disuse. We've become dependent on mediocre mass-produced goods and forgotten that better alternatives exist. We've lost the ability to create or even recognize quality. We've accepted declining standards as inevitable rather than questioning whether we gave up something valuable. The story of the axe is a microcosm of this broader pattern. It happened with hand tools. It happened with furniture. It happened with clothing. It happened across nearly every category of material goods. Can we reverse this? Can we recover lost knowledge and raise standards of quality? In some areas, yes. The craft movement, the maker movement, the traditional skills revival. These are all attempts to do exactly that. People are learning blacksmithing, woodworking, and other traditional crafts. They're seeking out quality tools and learning to use them properly. They're creating demand for craftsmanship. This is positive. But these movements remain small relative to the broader economy. They're not replacing industrial manufacturing. They're creating niches alongside it. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps we don't need everyone to use handmade traditional axes. Perhaps it's sufficient that the knowledge and skills are preserved by a dedicated minority, available to those who seek them. Perhaps the coexistence of mass-market cheap tools and traditional handcrafted quality tools serves different needs for different users. The casual user who needs an axe once a year can buy a cheap one. The serious user who needs an axe daily can invest in a quality one. The knowledge remains available to those who want it, even if it's not universal. But there's something lost when knowledge becomes niche rather than common. When Samuel Bridger was working in the Wyoming Valley in the 1840s, every trapper understood axes to some degree. They might not all have been experts, but they all had basic knowledge. They could evaluate quality, use proper technique, and maintain their tools. Today, that common knowledge is gone. Even among people who use axes regularly, many lack basic understanding of what makes a good tool or how to use it properly. The baseline level of knowledge has dropped dramatically. This matters because knowledge preservation requires a critical mass of practitioners. If only a few people know something, it's vulnerable to being lost again. If many people know it, it's more robust. The difference is between knowledge that exists in a few books and the memories of a handful of experts versus knowledge that's embedded in a culture and passed down through normal channels. The former is fragile, the latter is resilient. We've shifted from the latter to the former for most traditional skills. That makes our culture's knowledge base more fragile. What would it take to shift back, to make traditional knowledge common again rather than rare? It would require changes in education, economics, and culture. Schools would need to teach practical skills, not just academic subjects. The economic system would need to value quality and durability, not just low prices and volume. Culture would need to respect craftsmanship and traditional knowledge, not dismiss them as obsolete. These are large systemic changes. They won't happen quickly or easily, but they're not impossible. Cultural values can shift. Economic incentives can change. Education priorities can be revised. Some of this is already happening at small scale. Waldorf schools teach practical crafts. Tool companies like Lie-Nielsen and Veritas make premium hand tools for a growing market of craftsmen. Books and videos documenting traditional skills find eager audiences. These are seeds that might grow into broader changes, or they might remain niche interests. The future isn't determined. It depends on choices we make individually and collectively about what we value and what we preserve. Samuel Bridger died in 1862 at age 55, killed not by the wilderness that had been his home for 34 years, but by typhoid fever contracted during a rare trip to a settlement. His axe passed to Robert Crane, who used it for another 20 years before his own death. After that, the axe's history becomes unclear. It may have been used for decades more, or it may have been lost or discarded. Either way, that specific tool is gone, but the knowledge of how it was made and used survives in fragments, preserved by historians, traditional craftsmen, and stories passed down through generations. The lessons from Samuel's axe remain relevant. Quality matters, knowledge matters, technique matters. Cheap and convenient isn't always better than expensive and excellent. Mass production has advantages, but it also has costs. Traditional methods that seem obsolete might actually be superior in ways we've forgotten. Our ancestors weren't primitive. They were often highly skilled and knowledgeable. Dismissing their methods as outdated might mean losing valuable knowledge. Recovering that knowledge requires humility, curiosity, and willingness to learn from the past. The next time you pick up an axe, think about Samuel Bridger. Think about the difference between a tool that dulls after 10 swings and one that stays sharp through weeks of hard use. Think about the knowledge that created that difference. Think about what we've lost and what we might recover. And maybe, just maybe, start asking questions about what other knowledge we've forgotten and what it might be worth to remember it. Because the answer might be more than we realize. And the cost of forgetting might be higher than we want to pay.